Good evening, everyone. My name is Rick Valenta, and I'm the director of UQ's Sustainable Minerals Institute. And it's my pleasure to be your host this evening for the inaugural UQ Frank White Memorial Lecture. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respects to their ancestors and descendants as we walk together on the path to reconciliation. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Franklin White, family, friends, and colleagues of Professor Frank White, UQ colleagues, students, and alumni, distinguished guests, one and all. Before we begin our formal proceedings, a few housekeeping items. The bathrooms are located outside and to the left of the foyer, and in the unlikely case of an emergency, please exit via your nearest exit point and follow instructions from UQ staff. Thank you all for joining us this evening to celebrate the remarkable legacy of Professor Frank T.M. White. As many of you here will know, Professor White was an influential figure who laid the foundations for mining and metallurgical engineering at UQ. And to honor Professor Frank White's legacy, the Faculty of Engineering, Architecture, and Information Technology is hosting this, the inaugural Frank White Memorial Lecture. This new annual lecture series was inspired by Emeritus Professor Don McKee and Dr. Bob Bryan, AM, both of whom have joined us here this evening, so thank you very much. Our vision is for the Frank White Memorial Lecture to be an ongoing signature UQ event that seeks to bring together all disciplines of engineering to discuss the complex challenges of our future and how our field can be harnessed to address them. For those that aren't aware of Professor Frank T.M. White's history with the university, Frank was the founding professor of mining engineering at UQ in 1950. He brought with him a philosophical approach based on love of humanity and the values of globalism and equality. That has had an enduring impact at UQ. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Frank had worked in a variety of mining leadership roles across the Asia-Pacific region, and this early exposure to other nations created a deep appreciation of other cultures that stayed with Frank throughout the rest of his career. As an academic leader here in the 1950s, Frank was the first person to propose that the university should establish a residential college, especially and specifically for international students. And ultimately, Frank's advocacy on this issue was instrumental in the founding of International House, which remains one of 10 student residential colleges here at our St. Lucia campus. At the time, it's estimated there were about 100 students from Southeast Asia at UQ, and they were all here on the Colombo Plan scholarships. I have no doubt that Frank would be proud to see how UQ has evolved in the decades since, and the deep global connections that we have today running through all our education, research, and development programs. But Frank's encouragement of underrepresented groups on campus wasn't just limited to his advocacy for those early cohorts of international students. At a time when engineering was a male-dominated industry, he was also a progressive voice on the campus when it came to his support for women. The very first faculty member that Frank appointed to his department in 1951 was a woman, June McNichol, OAM, who worked as a metallurgist. He also encouraged his own niece to study metallurgy. And in 1957, she went on to become the first female graduate in this field at UQ. Undoubtedly, Frank's leadership was a crucial factor in establishing UQ as one of the world's top teaching and research institutions for mining and metallurgical engineering. As an example of this role, he played in the university's acquisition of the experimental mine at Indooroopilly in 1951. When Frank agreed to lease that facility from the Queensland government, it was a former silver mine that had sat empty and abandoned for 21 years. To others, it was simply a derelict facility, but Frank saw its potential as a laboratory for the resources sector that offered unlimited teaching and research opportunities. Today, the Julius Kirchnet Mineral Research Centre, or JKMRC as it's known, has grown to become Australia's largest research centre operating in the field of minerals research. It remains one of UQ's most treasured assets, and one of the very few on-site mining environments offered by educational institutions globally. So it's very special that we now have this annual opportunity to celebrate Professor Frank White and his legacy here at UQ. And it's especially meaningful that the inaugural guest speaker is none other than Frank's own son, Dr. Franklin White. Franklin has kindly made the journey from British Columbia to be here with us this evening. And Franklin White is a science writer, a public health sciences development consultant, and an author of Miner with a Heart of Gold. Franklin grew up talking about geology, mining, metallurgy, and educational development over the dining room table. I don't know what's odd about that, but during his medical and public health studies in Australia, Canada, and the UK, he worked summers in industry-related posts and has followed the field with a special interest in its historical development. A significant portion of his career has addressed environmental and occupational health, including epidemiological investigations and as a grantee with the US National Institutes of Health and other agencies. Now an adjunct professor with Dalhousie University, Franklin has held 2 endowed chairs, several operational posts, and for a recent 15-year period ran his own international consulting firm. He is a recipient of a Breakthrough Award for Creativity from the Academy for Educational Development and a Medal of Honor from the World Health Organization, the regional office for the Americas of the World Health Organization. This evening, Franklin is delivering a lecture tracing his father's contributions, from Australia's goldfields to the Fiji Department of Mines to mining rehabilitation in post-war Malaya, and then as founding professor of mining and metallurgical engineering at UQ. The lecture is entitled Insights on the Frank White Era. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Franklin White.
Well, thank you very much, Rick, and that was a lovely introduction. There'll be a little bit of overlap between what you said and what I'll present. Doing the formalities now. Professor Rick Valenta, Sustainable Minerals Institute. Professor Tom Baldock, Civil Engineering. Associate Professor Stephen Pratt, Chemical Engineering. Professor Ross Macquarie, Mechanical and Mining Engineering. Professor Saeed Manasadati, Deputy Associate Dean. Jennifer Carlson, Vice President, Advancement and Community Engagement. Weston Bruner, Associate Vice President. Emeritus Professor Don McKee, thank you, Don, for all of what you've done. And eminent Dr. Bob Bryan. I'm looking at Bob right now. Thank you too, Bob. My erstwhile neighbor, incidentally. Distinguished guests, alumni, staff, and especially students. This memorial lecture series is a wonderful tribute to my father's legacy, and I fully appreciate the commitment that has gone into it. Thank you very much. It is said that the greatest generation of the modern era, the most responsible and hardworking, were born 1901 to 1925. Frank White, born 1909, embodied those values. Australia then was a red shape on a British palette, an empire on which the sun never set, unsustainable. He played a role in its devolution. Frank and his sister, Emily, were raised in a family with mining roots. Their great-grandfather, William White, was born in 1822 in Gwinnett, Cornwall, once known as the mining capital of the world. His son, Thomas, migrated to Australia, where his son, in turn, my grandfather, Frank Sr., launched a construction firm and was twice elected Mayor of Kew, Victoria. I see my glass of water is down there. Thank you. That's great. I may need this once in a while. My dad viewed mining and metallurgy as complementary, integrated through mineral processing, ideally taught side by side. He was passionate about their human, environmental, and social impacts when these were not mainstream concerns. When he spoke, people paid attention, partly out of respect for his gravitas, but more so from a boots-on-the-ground perspective. He knew what he was talking about. His life story is a romantic tale, and it's doubtful if such a varied career would be possible today. Perhaps the original pioneering can only be done once, a golden age, when a generalist could take on challenges now deemed to require a specialist. Dramatis personae. Frank was a man of many parts, well-read, knowledgeable about flora and fauna, interested in philosophy, and up-to-date on world events. Learning violin and piano, he played in the children's orchestra. While attending Melbourne High School, he worked as an autopsy assistant. At Melbourne University, he sang a cappella, played cricket, and joined a rifle team. In Wiluna, Western Australia, he formed a choir in the mining tradition, joined the fledgling Masonic Lodge, and in 1932 met Tess Nunn, who arrived on one of the first trains to come into the town to take a secretarial post with a law firm. They shared musical interests, danced, played golf, and went on bush picnics to view the bird life and desert wildflowers, compensation for the dust storms and the flash floods. 3 years later, surveyor George Nunn, a player in the Goldfields water scheme, gave his daughter in marriage. To convey a sense of the times, here is an imaginary account of Tess breaking news of her engagement to an aunt, adapted from the late Maurice Kendall. "So tell me," asked Aunt Amelia, a member of the temperance movement, what is it that your fiancé does for a living?" "He's a metallurgist," replied Tess, self-consciously on the defensive. "What on earth is a metallurgist?" asked Amelia. "Oh, Auntie, you hit it on the head. He works alongside miners to figure out how to extract minerals from the rocks they bring out of the earth." Amelia was startled. Although resigned to her niece working in a remote goldfields town, she never imagined that Tess, a graduate of the iconic Presbyterian Ladies' College, would engage in such a relationship. "But Auntie, it's a truly fascinating occupation," said Tess, proudly noting that Frank was now Wiluna's chief metallurgical chemist at the tender age of 23. "I don't doubt it," said Amelia, trying to suppress her skepticism. "To express anything profound in chemical equations is so plainly impossible. There must be endless scope for well-paid advice on how to do it." "But don't you think that a life with a metallurgist would be rather, shall we say, humdrum?" Tess fell silent, reluctant to reveal the surprising depth of emotional energy she had plumbed below Frank's mineral-coated veneer. "It's not the minerals themselves," she said eventually. "It's what you do with them that matters." And so it was that Frank and Tessa's life together was never humdrum. On being a pioneer is one of the first people to do something. Applied to an organization, a first mover. Although such people sometimes have a competitive advantage, externalities are pivotal. The policy environment, institutional support, resource requirements. The pioneering spirit reflects our human journey of discovery and innovation, from fire to information technology. A trend is evident, from serendipity to systematic development of knowledge and skills. Take lithium, for which production needs to triple by 2025 and increase sixfold by 2030. Most pioneering is done by small, agile, and sometimes fragile companies, today's entrepreneurs. Meanwhile, established entities are burdened by momentum and inertia and may buy in later as part of their development strategies. For smaller firms, Scaling up is the next challenge, but whether by organic growth, mergers, acquisitions, or simply rebranding, this is no longer pioneering. As a UQ pioneer, Frank White built a durable advantage, a vibrant platform on which mineral engineering thrived, guided by a branching succession of leaders up to the present. In fact, all successful organizations are built on the foundation of prior work and are more than the sum of their parts. As Isaac Newton wrote in 1675, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Building on experience. A scholarship and prize winner at Melbourne U, Frank did not pursue graduate studies. The priority during the Great Depression was putting food on the table. Opportunity arose with the gold rush. In 1931, Wiluna Gold Mines hired him as a metallurgical chemist, applying flotation to gold extraction. Rapidly promoted, he simultaneously served as a consultant to Victor Lego and Company, a Melbourne firm producing arsenic. Next, he became a mill superintendent at legendary Hill 50, where he earned a certificate of competency as an underground superintendent. 2 years later, qualifying as a registered mine manager. A progression that reflects the value of professional certification as distinct from academic qualifications. Soon after, he became mine manager for Edudina Consolidated Gold Mines. Excuse me. Recruited by the British Colonial Service in 1937, he established Fiji's Department of Mines, during which he carried out Fiji's first geological survey. White's map is now held by the Colonial Archives, London. He was a founder and later president of the Fiji Institute of Science and Technology, where he published on geology and volcanology. With onset of the Pacific War in December 1941, in addition to mining duties, he became a special platoon commander, training soldiers in demolition. To expand the dramatis personae, in September 1941, my sister Hilary was born in Suva. In January 1942, Tess and Hilary were evacuated to New Zealand, returning to Fiji 14 months later when Tess resumed her part-time role as a wireless and cable decoder. Following Japan's surrender in September 1945, my dad transferred to Malaya, while Mum and Hilary relocated to Perth, where I was born in mid-1946. We then relocated to join my dad in Kuala Lumpur, where his role was to rehabilitate Malaya's war-damaged tin mining industry. His site visits were conducted under armed escort due to a militant communist insurgency, isolated mines being prime targets. But the rehabilitation effort was successful. By 1948, the economic value exceeded pre-war levels, and by 1949, surpassed this by 50%. During this period, he qualified as a magistrate, wrote mining law, and served on the commission to establish the University of Malaya. In 1949, learning of UQ's plans to establish a mining engineering department, he applied for its leadership. When appointed founding professor in 1950, his only academic qualification was his bachelor's degree in metallurgy, remarkable by today's norms. In recognition of his unusual mix of competencies, however, UQ promptly conferred a mining degree upon him. And within a year, he expanded the departmental scope to include metallurgy. Pioneers could do such things. 4 decades later, in 1990, I participated in the Frank White Building naming ceremony, moderated by Chancellor Sir James Foots, who stated, and I quote, "3 things stand out in Frank White's career here. Firstly, there was the development from scratch of a department that in 15 years led the field in Australian universities. Much of this success was due to his ability to communicate with leaders of the mining and metallurgical industries and so gain their confidence in his competence and his vision for the education of future leaders. He knew the industry and its problems, and he knew the people who ran it. He was able to pick the type of person who could succeed in its environment. Secondly, the rehabilitation of the university mine to teach the practical aspects of mining engineering stands as a monument to his inspiration. Thirdly, he paved the way for the remarkable worldwide success of the Julius Kritznet Mineral Research Laboratories, achieved under the direction of Alban Lynch and colleagues. This testimony by Jim Foots, formerly Mount Isa Mines General Manager, reveals how well he understood my dad's foundational contribution. Initial challenges. On appointment, he was assigned 4 final year students, no faculty, and 1 technical staff member. As mentioned by Rick, metallurgist June McNichol. In 1951, he promoted June, who thereby became engineering's sole female faculty member at that time. Iconic. As documented in Harrison Bryan's official history, that's Bob's older brother, I believe, UQ in the 1950s was frugally financed by a government more concerned with fiscal control than higher education. Notions like academic freedom were anathema. There was a space shortage, continued use of World War II Quonset huts, and competition for the lovely sandstone buildings emerging around the Great Court. It's wonderful to walk around them, as I did yesterday, in the company of Weston. Mining and metallurgy was originally assigned to the old George Street campus. However, while setting up that venue, Frank became motivated by the greater potential for relevant teaching and research at the abandoned Finney Hill mine at Indooroopilly. Through chatting with our neighbor, Walter Bryan, professor of geology, he had become aware of this discontinued mine. After exploring title and remediation issues, his proposal to redevelop it for this purpose was supported by state mining engineer Ian Morley, who facilitated a government lease for the property. In 1951, UQ's experimental mine came into being. Within a few short years, much of mining and extractive metallurgy relocated from George Street to UQEM, reflecting their integration at operational mine sites. Another epiphany was to participate in the Colombo Plan, through which Burmese student practitioners would learn mining principles in the classroom and hands-on skills at UQEM. This contributed materially to its development, including the sinking of an incline shaft. Everyone enjoyed the tremendous esprit de corps, and UQEM's uniqueness captured imaginations across Australia. University Mine. UQEM started as a seat of the pants initiative, the early planning drafted on our dining room table while we ate in the kitchen, a blending of organizational and family culture. As a departmental volunteer later, I built a scale model of it. In 1951, the underground workings were flooded at all levels below 116 feet, which opened out of the hillside with an adit, as it still does, of course, enabling gravity drainage. Water was pumped out as rehabilitation reached lower levels. The air was dank and ventilation a priority for health and safety, and for it to function as a training venue. An explosive magazine was designated to demonstrate safe underground storage. Permanent lighting was installed to facilitate upgrading and to illustrate best practices. A cantilever head frame was designed and constructed for the main shaft, while another shaft was installed with a large fan to draw fresh air through the mine. And the new incline shaft sunk to connect with the 140-foot level. The open cut was rejigged with a tramway, furnished with a ballistic mortar for testing explosives and other equipment for experimental applications. We saw a nice photo of that in the collage that started out our event this evening. Surface installations were constructed, a crusher station, fine ore bins, an anechoic chamber for noise measurement, a pilot plant for mineral processing studies, bench laboratories, and so on. With economy in mind, UQAM modeled the industry realities of the time. Fibro-cement walls over mostly wood frames with galvanized iron roofs. A core function of UQAM was project-based learning. The head frame was a student project designed under supervision. It became an occupational health and safety demonstration venue for medicine. Botany students labeled flora at the sites. Just as one cannot learn medicine without a teaching hospital, law without viewing a courtroom in action, or agriculture without a farm, so too with mineral engineering. My dad hosted school groups at the mine, distributed a tape about the field to high schools, and gave invited talks at schools. We have two people here who actually participated in that, friends of mine from way back then, and so they'll be able to relate to that. About leadership. Authentic leaders translate uncertainty into opportunity, empowering others and leading by example. However, before any leader can emerge, society shapes that person. We all owe something to our forebears and mentors, what they learned from their own struggles, whether giants or not. Frank had sound role models. To mention one, at Melbourne U, he studied under John Neil Greenwood, whose graduates have had a major impact on mineral industry development throughout Australia. Frank had people skills, honed in the goldfields and his subsequent roles, versed in 3 military cultures, in Fiji under New Zealand and then US command, and Malaya with the British post-war military administration. He knew that people experience different realities. He was concerned about how society perceived the industry and urged students to present themselves in a professional manner. Shoes shined, shirts tucked in, long socks pulled up, Bermuda shorts being in vogue. While critical of beards, he allowed himself a mustache. A favorite aphorism was, if you can't rise in your profession, raise your profession. An advocate for AUSIMM and patron of the newly formed Student Mining and Metallurgical Association, MAMA, he was a motivator who tried to bring out the best in people. And while enjoying debate, he applied diplomacy with UQ, industry, and granting bodies. Incidentally, I want to meet with someone from MAMA this evening. I brought along 4 volumes of the old MAMA bulletin with me. I'd like to pass them on for the archives. He believed in assigning the best teachers to undergraduates because once a student had committed to graduate studies, they should be sufficiently motivated to become their own best teachers. I am told he was the only engineering full professor to give opening lectures to first-year students. Perhaps testimony to this philosophy is that 5 Rhodes Scholars emerged during his tenure. Diversification was a goal. The first woman graduate, as Rick mentioned, in 1956 was Jill White, and these who took up metallurgy. I'll have to check whether it's 56 or 57. Just imagine her courage. The industry at large still lacks gender balance, although on viewing JKMRC and SMI websites, UQ is in the vanguard in this respect. And despite White Australia attitudes, he sought applicants from Asia. By 1965, 15 had graduated, starting with Prakash Jain from India in 1957. The first PhDs were awarded in 1965, including the late T.C. Rao, whose leadership of mineral engineering in India is widely celebrated. And T.C. Rao, incidentally, just passed away just a few weeks ago, very sadly, but well honored. Frank's leadership style reflected a society transitioning from command models to more participatory approaches. He became an advocate for Theory Y in McGregor's 1960 classic, The Human Side of Enterprise, and made it required reading. I took the hint. I read it myself. Viewing leadership as a network of shared responsibility and mutual support, I'll illustrate this with 3 vignettes. His UQ appointment was signed off by Vice Chancellor John D. Story. Education Undersecretary from 1906 to 1920, at the age of 42, he played a lead role in establishing the university in 1909, my dad's birth year, and became its first full-time Vice Chancellor in 1938. Affectionately known as Old Story, he was 81 years old when he and my dad became acquainted. My key observation, leadership can be potent across generations, and we can now add, witness Deborah Terry, irrespective of gender. Another was Julius Kritschnitt, Mount Isa Mines chairman from 1937 to 1953. In her memoir, Tess, my mum, stated that someone on Frank's selection committee told her, "It was my vote that put him there." She didn't name him, but intuition tells me that this was Kritschnitt. On retirement, he moved from Mount Isa to a riverside bungalow in Indooroopilly and served on the engineering faculty board from 1954 to 1962. Frank would visit him at home to chat, and if in the car, I would wait outside to be seen but not heard. I'm making up for that now. The 3rd vignette is about Jim Bruff, the resident mine assistant who lived on site. Yes, this too is leadership. To support the mission, to take responsibility for one's role, and to facilitate others. Jim, an experienced miner, contributed practical input and was a fluent guide for students, faculty, staff, and visitors. Great institutions are built by people who, while performing their own roles, contribute to a greater whole. Leadership, support, and teamwork. Generalist or specialist? I referred earlier to a golden age when the generalist could take on challenges now deemed to require a specialist. However, as Paul Jenberg of Studio X, an engineering science hub for energy innovation, argues, there has been so much talk in the corporate world about specializing that we've forgotten the value of a generalist. We trap ourselves in the golden cage of specialization, but businesses need generalists to connect the dots. I think it's fair to say that if you don't have generalists, you end up with silos. Now, being a specialist or a generalist often depends on context, and neither should result in being trapped. Golden age and golden cage arguments are relative and depend on how you define success. You can change your hat if you wish, as my dad did several times. The important underlying value is to commit to lifelong learning. He would advocate, never stop thinking, never stop learning, and apply what you learn. A competent generalist is increasingly hard to find. To paraphrase my cousin, Perry Matthews, an air traffic control guru who lives in Mooloolaba now, someone who knows enough about a lot, who can manage processes through to outcomes, on schedule and on budget, duly documented, and who knows what he doesn't know, when to blow a whistle before the cavalry is needed, close quote. Frank, as a multi-skilled generalist, was well able to get things done, but we may wonder, would such a person succeed in academia today? Research and development. As a 1930 Melbourne U undergraduate, Frank White received minimal research training, yet his approach aligns with a robust definition of research, rigorous inquiry to advance knowledge and improve practices. At a time when little research of any type was being conducted at UQ, he negotiated research and development frameworks with industry, a novel approach for this period. The first grant appeared in 1955 from the Queensland Coal Owners Association to assess dust exposures, closely followed by grants from the Australian Atomic Energy Commission and Union Carbide USA. Student research began in 1958 with grants from General Motors Holden and Zinc Corporation. Governing the pace of grant acquisition was the emergence of graduate degree offerings and recruitment of faculty with research skills. Early faculty like Jim Waring was spread too thin with undergraduate teaching to take on research, but this evolved rapidly during the 1950s. Len Hogan on solidification of metals, Rex Bull on flotation and leaching, Bill Vance on rock mechanics, Cecil Gregory on airflow and illumination. Alban Lynch was recruited in 1958 as the first research officer based at UQEM. I met them all, tagging along with my dad, the brat, as June McNichol jokingly referred to me when she thought we were out of earshot. And on that note, I'm just going to grab another glass of water over here, excuse me. Don't want to run out. A little bit jet lagged. In 1958, Frank delivered a major strategic paper at AusIMM in Melbourne to guide mineral industry research in Australia. In 1959, the Australian Mineral Industries Research Association, AMIRA, was formed. Administered by Beryl Jacka, Secretary of AusIMM, she and Frank frequently conferred on its development. With Alban Lynch in 1961, Frank played a critical role in initiating the mineral processing revolution, with a grant from the Australian Institute of Nuclear Science and Engineering for fundamental aspects in the automatic control of comminution processes. Followed in 1962 and 1964 by AMIRA grants to White and Lynch to develop a system for automatic control of ore grinding circuits. A minerals industries research and technical service, MIRTS, M-I-R-T-S, emerged at UQEM in the early 1960s. And in 1965, Professor White reviewed UQEM-based research at the 8th Commonwealth Mining and Metallurgical Congress. A thematic approach is evident from this published report. At the time he stepped down in 1966, UQEM had become a research-intensive facility. Mining, metallurgy, and society. At the 1990 building ceremony, I overheard a comment that mining was earth-moving, but Frank held a broader view. As published in the Northern Miner, 1967, mining's more than just digging out the ore. The modern approach involves consideration of the total environment. Beyond such time-honored concerns as rock stability, extraction, processing, he considered the human factors: air quality, radiation, illumination, noise, vibration. He addressed the psychological and sociological environment, drawing from my late sister Hillary's master's thesis on community development in single industry towns. Her findings enriched his own thoughts on sustainability. He promoted the total environment of mining to professional and policy groups and to an urban society happily unaware of the source of their material wealth. If alive today, he would argue that without mining, you can forget your EV, cell phone, and other IT gadgets, forget all transport except horse and cart, and you may even argue the cart. Without concrete or metals, bridges and stadia cannot be built, and you can forget electricity, as even renewables depend on mining. In his inaugural JKMRC lecture in 1970, my dad declared, "Big industries are not necessarily great industries." Get it? Big industries are not necessarily great industries. He noted that management once focused almost entirely on productivity, output, wastage, errors, damage, and so on. He traced the evolution of interest towards safety and injuries, observing that even these were viewed mostly from an economic perspective, such as time loss, absenteeism, that affect the bottom line. Turning to the present, or to his present, half a century ago, he drew attention to societal perspectives, stating, Ours will become a really great industry when all, not only some, of the corporate entities within it achieve the ultimate good of its dual functions, economic and social, beyond material goods, creating satisfaction at all stages in the process. A challenge, not just what it does, but how well it is done and seen to be done. Not just what it does, but how well it is done and seen to be done. On sustainability, it is said that perception is 9/10 of reality. And the popular perception of extraction companies is that many are not stellar citizens regarding their environmental impacts, developing country practices, and community relations. More than an image problem, recognizing why these perceptions exist is critical, not only for advocacy, but for effective leadership and management. Debate surrounding the extractive industry is polarized by extreme views, with elements of denial in both directions. Self-styled advocates use their cell phones daily, perhaps sitting in their EVs, neither of which could exist without minerals. For some of these folk, virtually all mining is bad, which makes about as much sense as viewing whales as one species, when in fact there are 91. At the other extreme, holdouts reject any role for a fossil fuel in climate change and reluctant to support nuclear power to stabilize the grid for incoming renewables. Their motivations and agendas are complex, yet the need for convergence is urgent to reshape materials and energy for a world in crisis. If alive today, my father would find it puzzling that the world's fourth-ranking uranium producer generates no nuclear power itself and remains heavily reliant on coal for electricity. In exploring this cognitive dissonance, I became aware of a stigma with even deeper roots. While the book of Job depicts mining poetically as a search for wisdom, other works in the Old Testament refer to such work as being counter to God's plan, which explains some negative views, as exploited in the 2014 film Noah, aligning a fictitious Tubal Cain, the blacksmith of Genesis, played by Russell Crowe, with murder and ecocide. We may contrast this with Longfellow's The Village Blacksmith, which extolled heroic qualities of character. However, such poetic gems hold no box office value or grist for social media soundbites dominated by misinformation, disinformation, and confirmation bias. Comparable stereotypes imbue Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, rated by Goodreads as the best fantasy of the 20th century. In mining greedily for the fictional metal mithril, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm uncovered a Balrog, a demon of fire and darkness who slays them. Spectacular in Peter Jackson's film series, this highly imaginative story appeals to impressionable audiences far more than verifiable fact. Maybe Balrog should be part of the mining engineering syllabus at UQ. Yet our mineral culture is far more ancient and verifiable than such media extravaganzas or misrepresented biblical myths. Ngwenya mine in Eswatini dates from 43,000 years BCE, a World Heritage Site. Superstition, misrepresentation, and heroic poetry aside, however, mining and smelting across cultures from historical to present time is sadly replete with exploitation, corruption, illegalities, indigenous abuse, gender issues, dam failures, slavery and child labor, often under inhumane conditions, resulting in illness and death. These verifiable realities underlie many negative perceptions. In the Congo earlier this year, Pope Francis urged mining to uphold the UN goal to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns, SDG 12. He also advocated a more circular economy. I'm not a religious person, but I'm sure we all agree that these aims align with sound principles. In Australia, mining was once a dangerous occupation. To quote from Tessa's memoir, when my dad was mine manager at Edudina in 1936, a boiler had blown, and he had to treat the engineer for burns and bandage him head to foot. On return from hospital in Kalgoorlie, he thanked Frank. "You did a good job of first aid on me. The doctors say you saved my life." In Fiji, Frank White reviewed Commonwealth laws and regulations to guide new legislation and define governance principles, including taxation and sustainability. And among the laws and policies he later wrote for Malaya were those defining religious and cultural sites, parks and ecological reserves as off-limits for mining. Sustainability and governance are clearly not new challenges. They're ongoing. Then and now, mining must be responsible to human concerns and try to follow best practices. I know I'm preaching to the converted. 2021 data for Australia reveal a mortality risk in agriculture, forestry and fishing some 4.5 times higher than for mining, itself now comparable to the safety of arts and recreation services. An accomplishment that may fly in the face of popular and even official misconception, one that should be celebrated. Has it been celebrated? Clearly, health and safety goals are achievable. Yet the industry still has many environmental, social, and governance ESG challenges that require attention, especially on the world stage. While ESG as a planning and evaluation tool is burdened by contradictions, including greenwashing, it has lifted visions and moved the debate forward. Until we have a better rubric, let's not throw it out with the bathwater. If alive, my father would applaud the diversity and inclusion evident in how the field is represented at UQ today. He would admire the interdisciplinary synergy, while ever alert to the potential fragmentation of mineral disciplines themselves. On society as a whole, he would highlight the weak socio-political comprehension about an industry on which any coherent energy transition depends. On ecological challenges, he would urge industry and academia to work towards a more circular economy. While appreciating the role of aspirational goals, as an engineer, he would advocate, promise what you can deliver and deliver what you promise. Prioritizing youth, he would view advocacy as necessary but not sufficient. It must be informed and supported by competent mineral science and engineering graduates. A positive future, society and industry doing right things right. Society and industry doing right things right. Epilogue. Frank White was approached by McGill University in 1965 to revitalize mining engineering and applied geophysics. Telling that story exceeds my time, save to mention that Montreal rejuvenated his musical interests. He began trading postage stamps and took up snowshoeing. Throughout life, he had a poetic streak, and I still get a kick out of the alliterative title of his 1969 McGill paper with Bill Boswick, Trends in the Instrumental Assessment of Industrial Dustiness. Beautiful. He died unexpectedly in Montreal in 1971, 62 years of age. His ashes scattered at Mont Saint-Hilaire. 77 myself, I now realize how young he was. Of jovial disposition, he would appreciate the homily. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, a tribute to the earth sciences. Today, we might wonder about the carbon footprint of cremation, but more important to contemplate is the fire of the man who gave rise to those ashes. The apex of his life's work was right here at UQ, where his heart and soul found greatest expression. Beyond engineering, he was an advocate for intercultural learning. His success in attracting students from home and abroad broke new ground and led, in 1954, to his voluntary appointment as UQ's first warden for overseas students to guide this aspect of development. As captured in Basil Shaw's Official History of International House, it was he who conceived of the college and understood the labyrinthine university politics. Conclusion. Finally. My dad enjoyed mixed metaphors, so I'll close with one. The early bird may get the worm, but the second mouse may get the cheese. Translation, start early and success may follow, and those who follow success may build on it. My message to current and future engineers and scientists, 21st century pioneering is yours to define. And have fun while you're doing it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Do we have sound here? Yes. Thank you very much for a very engaging lecture, and I found it fascinating to hear the description of how so many of the giants that strode the earth in that time connected up to each other, and to hear the names of people who appear on buildings and memorial gardens and so on. So it was a real a tour de force. And one thing that struck me was it's not the first time that someone from that era has been described where I think we naturally assume that they had no interest in sustainability, or they had no interest in things that we consider to be modern, and that we've turned out to be completely wrong, and that people like your father had a really strong, belief in things that we would consider not to have been considered important at that time. But I can answer one question that you had, and that was, are there people who combine an industry career and an academic career? Is there still importance placed on that in the university? And I can certainly confirm that that's the case. And I guess I'm an example of that, with 25 years in industry and 10 years in a university setting. But enough. What I'd like to do now is throw things open for questions. So we have some roving microphones in the room, and it'd be wonderful if anybody had any questions or comments or anything you'd like to say in response to that very interesting and fascinating lecture.
Thank you so much, Franklin. You talked a lot about the way that your father clued into certain trends that are incredibly important today. Is there anything about the way the industry has evolved to this point that would really surprise your father, given his foresight?
Oh, I'm sure that there are many, many aspects that would surprise him. He was ahead of his times, but he was still a man of his time, so he was kind of both, when he was born, there were people still using horse and buggy and so on. It's a tremendous spectrum of scientific and engineering development that's happened, and in so many fields throughout his lifetime and up to the present. I think he would be amazed, because he would have to be, because I'm amazed that I've got this cell phone in my pocket, and I can talk to people, without having to go to a telephone booth. There are all kinds of things that I don't think 50 years ago we would have imagined, So I don't want to absorb too much time there, but yes, of course, things move on. But picking up on Rick's point, certainly ideas have their day in a sense. And so there were people then who were concerned about sustainability and so forth, but it had not captured the popular imagination. It wasn't a media issue, for example, It had not become a political concern, if you like. And so that, in a way, tends to raise the agenda, make it more visible. But I think a lot of people have had these thoughts for a long time. Actually, the first paper that addresses the contribution of the coal industry to not just air quality, but for the potential of a greenhouse effect was written in the 1890s, and it's now being unearthed and making its rounds on social media, So the other thing that tends to stand in the way of recognizing the contributions of the past is the way we teach graduate students. And certainly at the master's level, there's a tendency to say, well, for your lit review, I want you to go back at least 10 years. 10 years is nothing, depends on the field. But if you go back 10 years, you might think, oh gosh, there's nothing there that relates to what I'm working on, so I'm the first. You may not be the first, you may be the umpteenth. We keep rediscovering and reinventing things. We've put blinkers around the models we use in certain types of studies and research and so forth. They're kind of cookie cutter, but they're not necessarily reaching out sufficiently to get those tangential inputs and so forth. And picking up another point of Rick's, the rhetorical question that I put, I mean, it's wonderful that there would still be people at UQ who would move in and out of industry, in and out of government and so forth. To me, these are not pure academics. To me, these are the practitioner scholars. And in that sense, my dad was a model for me. I'm a practitioner scholar, mostly in the health sciences, but I've worked in government, I've worked in private sector, I've worked clinically, I've worked in universities, I've run a consultant company, but I didn't spend my entire career in a university. I think that's for fields that have practical application. If you want to be real to the industry you serve, you've got to have some way of relating to it. They say about creative writing that you cannot really be a good creative writer if you yourself have not experienced something about that which you're writing about. It has to come from your own experience to some extent. And I think all of the best literature people are drawing to some extent from themselves. They're not inventing it. They're actually harvesting the value of their experience and then reforming it and putting it out in some form that someone would say this is original literature, or, very good creative writing, So.
Do we have any other questions? I have one. So I know this is a lecture about your father, but I was fascinated by the fact that you obviously spend a lot of time doing various things relating to the mining industry and also being immersed in a sort of mining environment as you grew up. And it's a two-part question. One is, were you ever tempted to go into the same area as your father? And number two, since you clearly didn't, did that exposure to the mining industry inform your career history? Because to me, it seems like those two different disciplines are not entirely disconnected.
No, they're not. And in fact, there's quite an overlap between mining and medicine and health science and so on. It goes back a long, long way. In answer to your first question, yeah, I strongly considered going into mining and metallurgy myself. And I'm not quite sure whether I came up with this or someone else told me at some stage, but then it kind of dawned on me that if I did that, it would be like the old saying, nothing will grow in the shade of a big tree. So I thought, okay, I better do something different, But interestingly, having chose health sciences, I found that the clinical side was not so appealing. It was, in a sense, too little, too late. The problem had already happened, and the person has turned up, and they've had their life experience at whatever age that has given the problem that they have. So I think the exposure to mining environments, issues of safety, health, illumination, dust, and so forth, that I was already aware of, guided me very, very quickly into public health and preventive medicine, rather than simply diagnosis essentially after the fact, when it's too late to do things that would be truly effective, and to think in terms of groups rather than individuals. So your entire workforce in an underground mine, for example, is potentially exposed to these hazards, you know. So whatever intervention you choose to make to be effective, it can't just be for the individual. It has to be something that will benefit everybody who's in that environment. So yes, it informed me. It shaped a lot of what I did, not only in environmental and occupational health, and other areas too, but yes, it really did come out of essentially the way I was raised, you know, and the influence of my dad. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
We have any other questions? Yes, we have one here.
In view of the bad press the industry has been receiving for a number of years, do you have any advice on how the industry can address the both health and environmental issues to improve its image?
Yeah, you know, I puzzle over that too. I think it's extremely difficult. I tried to bring out what's going on there, and I think some of these issues are old prejudices as well. And, you know, when people say mining, most, you know, when people hear or see the word mining, they think of maybe the Cape Breton coal mines and disasters and so on. But I had a wonderful day yesterday out at JKMRC in the Bryan Geology Center there as well. And some of the stuff that's being done is outstanding, and yet it doesn't really, I don't think it gets public exposure. I think far more needs to be done about, it's not just promotion or trying to change image, it's to communicate the value and the excitement of what it is you're about. That will be stimulating to younger people, some of whom will have the enthusiasm and the interest and the curiosity to get into that field and be part of it. Coming back to the health field, something that really annoys me with the teaching of, say, public health, is that there's a tendency to think, oh, our role is advocacy when it comes to environmental exposures and so on. So we must talk about it. But we don't talk about the solutions, and the solutions are not going to come from health scientists. They're going to come from engineers, you know. So I don't think society really recognizes that at this particular time. I think a lot needs to be done to put the message out more effectively. Again, coming back to the exciting day I had yesterday, there's nobody there in the organization, maybe it's a funding issue, whose prime responsibility is public communication, you know. But it's not just PR. You won't close the gap with PR. You close the gap with understanding, with knowledge and understanding. You've got to get that convergence going. I'm heartened by the fact that Greta Thunberg, we all recognize who she is, but she is now strongly pro-nuclear, you know, and she's taking on Greenpeace, and there's a few other people like that now. It's an epiphany. It's a breakthrough, and but you need to get what's the word, role models like that on side, and you do it with information. You do it with not with mythology, you do it with actual information. You appeal to people's sense of rationality and logic and so forth. Politicians are part of the problem. I mean, part of the problem is our election cycle, whether it be 4 or 5 years, you know. That means you think only in 4 or 5 year blocks, you know. But my understanding is to build a lithium mine might take 5 to 10 years just to get the thing off the ground, you know. To build a nuclear power station might take about that length of time, you know. Now, technology is going to help quite a bit with, for example, small modular reactors that apparently can be built in a warehouse and put out in greater numbers and so forth. But I think that there's a mismatch between the way society is organized and our ability to pick up on the kinds of things, investments that need to be made to make that difference in the long term. We're too short term in thinking. Actually, the Chinese might be much better than we are in that regard. But our cultural background is holding, I say Western cultural background, is holding us back in a sense, because we're not thinking sufficiently long term in terms of turning the ship around. You know, it's a big ship, and it takes a lot of turning to change course. You know.
Leanne, we have.
Hi, I might, if I can be indulged, make a comment and then ask a question. So I really just wanted to thank you for the way that you talked about your father and very humanly, but particularly as a female engineer who didn't do mining or metallurgical but could have. It's really interesting that everything he was doing we're still doing, and I know there's people in this room still doing it, and we are getting some success.
Yes.
But to have, you know, his passion at that time is really good to hear. And also your cousin, I assume, graduating as the first female mining engineer actually before Elsa Shepherd, who was one of my mentors, who was in 1965, so I didn't know that. So thank you for that. My question was, he obviously had an interest in the environment and social. Was there any Indigenous engagement, any reflections on what he would think now about our role as an industry with Aboriginal
Could you
people?
just repeat the question again? I got some of it, but not all of it.
Was there any reflections on Indigenous affairs, Indigenous engagement, considering the time, the way that he might
In
have
that
thought
time.
about that
Yes.
in that social sort of, was it
Yes,
an issue
yes.
or was
okay. Yeah, I think it's a hell of a good question. Excuse the French. Yes, I think it was ironic. You know, the Colombo Plan was a Commonwealth human development plan that was defined really around the need for national development in Asia-Pacific countries and the role that a country like Australia could play to synergize some of that development through its educational capacity and so forth. Ironically, there was no comparable measure that addressed the potential and the need for Indigenous Australians to benefit in a comparable way. So there was nothing that you could say was done at that time at an official level that would have facilitated Indigenous people coming in at higher educational levels and so forth. I will add also that an approach was made, it's in my book, I've documented it, to the Department of Mining and Metallurgical Engineering regarding the training in mining engineering for Indigenous people from a community in the Torres Strait area. And I understand my dad explored that with the Department of Education, and again, there was no facilitation, no funding available. They were interested, the community was interested in developing a wolfram ore body for the production of tungsten, but it got nowhere. But yes, it came up, but there was no mechanism that really favored the development of indigenous people in mining that was at all comparable to what was being available for the mainstream within Australia or people coming in under the Colombo Plan or other schemes, you know. So they were all nationally defined. Even now, when we look at development policy, and I've had something to do with that, mostly from Canada, but actually a lot of places through my other work. But it's usually defined around the national needs of a country. And you get these agendas that come out, you know. Sometimes they're internationally defined. And when they are internationally defined, they tend to be top-down, not bottom-up, you know. And that would be another criticism of the international development model, is that it's not sufficiently community-based. The people who are addressing those things at community level are usually non-governmental organizations, you know. And in fact, I think the advocacy for the Torres Strait group was a church group. They came to make the case, could there be a program for their indigenous community? So, yeah. And that would have been a non-governmental group, you know, classical, yeah, yeah. Thanks for the question, it's a really good one, yeah.
Well, I think we're now 25 minutes past when we were supposed to have finished, but it's been I want to thank you and everyone for a you know, really fascinating discussion. It's been wonderful that you've been able to travel to be with us, to deliver this inaugural lecture, and to really reflect on the enormous impact that your father, Professor Frank White, has had on the university. And there's not a single doubt that we would not be in the position we are today without his leadership and influence. So it's been just wonderful to have you. So that really concludes the lecture and our formal proceedings. It's been a pleasure to be your host for this evening. I'd once again like to thank you, Dr. Franklin White, the family, friends, colleagues of Professor Frank White, all of our UQ colleagues, students and alumni, and other distinguished guests. Now, I want to encourage you to remain for a little while join us in the foyer to continue the celebration, to ask more questions and have more discussions. I had a few more up my sleeve, but I thought, let's get out to the drinks and the food. Enjoy the hospitality, the opportunity to network with our wonderful engineering community. Thank you very much again for a fascinating talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.